our speaker tonight is Ryan Suttle. He's a consulting arborist with HortScience Bartlett Consulting. And not only is he an accomplished arborist, but he also has a master's degree in environmental conservation, focusing on arboriculture and urban forestry. So I suspect that is how he became interested in the whole lifespan of trees and even how dead trees are an important part of the environment. So I'm looking forward to his views on when to leave a tree alone, even in an urban environment.
Yeah, thanks again for having me today. I'm really excited to be here. I'm here kind of representing mainly tree care for birds and HortScience Bartlett Consulting, kind of both out of the Bay Area today. So give us a brief outline of where we'll go. I'll start with a little bit of an introduction kind of to my practice and what I do on a day-to-day basis. Talk about the habitat value, starting from all trees, kind of funneling down to those dead, dying, and decaying trees and how those are uniquely beneficial to wildlife, even in our urban areas. And then I'll talk about managing those. How I approach this, it's kind of a combination of science and art and practice. Some tough decisions need to be made. I'll talk about two case studies that I really had a lot of fun with professionally, and then at the end we'll have some time for a Q&A. All right, so here is the introduction. That was already a great introduction, so I don't need to say anything else about myself, and I will just breeze through this. Some folks might be wondering what a consulting arborist actually does on a day-to-day basis. I'm not out running the chainsaw every day. I do most of my work from the ground in kind of two camps, tree risk assessment and preserving trees during construction. So tree risk assessment is looking at something like this tree on the left. Ideally, I would have gotten there before that stem broke, but it's looking at how likely trees are to break and what the consequences are essentially within a defined time frame. In the Bay Area, where I'm out of, I'm coming into this meeting from Berkeley, California today. There is tremendous pressure for housing. I'm sure it's similar throughout much of Southern California, and most of the areas are already developed. So a lot of the housing comes in the form of infill development right up against trees. So another big part of my job is trying to preserve these old trees, these big trees that are valuable to people and wildlife, while also trying to get housing built. The trees don't always win, but I try my best to keep these old trees in the landscape by assessing their safety and preserving them on these sites. So what brought me here today was we were contacted at Tree Care for Birds and Other Wildlife. I volunteer for them, and it's a really neat organization. It was formed in response to tree-related wildlife emergencies. Some people might be aware of this on the call today, but there was one in particular that really sparked this need. There's these mature ficuses around an downtown Oakland post office. It's a noisy area, buses and trucks and people. You might think this is horrible bird habitat, but the black crowned night heron, this bird on the left, the official bird of Oakland, California, nests in a group of these trees every year. So this tree I visited a couple years ago, and I think it had 20-ish nests, heron nests in there. Back in 2015, I believe, a tree crew showed up and started pruning this tree during the breeding season. And as they were cutting branches out of the tree, baby birds were falling to the ground and getting injured. And it was just really a bad occurrence. Some pedestrians walking by were members of the now renamed Golden Gate Bird Alliance and called the city to put a stop to it. And wildlife rescuers involved. Luckily, all the birds were able to be rehabilitated, but it still made the news. It was a huge deal. It was such a big deal that a federal investigation took place. This was in violation of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And it was just a huge mess. And as arborists, we wanted to come together to figure out how we can more responsibly work around birds and, uh, in some cases, manage trees in a way that's actually beneficial for them. So a little bit about heron nests here. They're noisy. There were 20 plus nests in this tree. The issue wasn't that the arborist didn't know the birds were there. It was that they didn't know that pruning the tree was a bad idea and against federal law, which is where tree care for birds comes in. Yeah, I mean, you can see that the sidewalk is covered with bird poop. You could not have missed those birds. So tree care for birds formed in response to this. We didn't quite know how we wanted to do it, but we knew that we wanted to change what we were seeing for the better using our expertise and teaming up with wildlife biologists. To that end, we wrote a best management practice for managing trees and assessing trees for wildlife value. We host trainings every year to train wildlife, to make people wildlife trained arborists, technically. And as a very broad overview, it covers recommendations for determining habitat value of both individual trees and areas that surround the tree, with the intent of figuring out whether it's okay to proceed with tree care operations and when you need to call a wildlife biologist when an arborist is just simply over their head with wildlife. We also do some really fun trainings, which kind of gets to what we are going to talk about, what I'm going to talk about today. Here's a recent one we did at Colma, in Colma, Cypress Lawn Cemetery Arboretum here in the Bay Area. They have these really, really enormous Monterey cypress trees that were planted around 130, 140 years ago. Some of them are reaching the end of their natural life, and rather than removing them entirely and losing these big features, they are keeping them in place, and sometimes improving them for wildlife use. So we see my friend Carson here on the left. He's a very talented climber. He is an artist with a chainsaw, and what he's doing here is creating an artificial cavity in the tree, kind of like a birdhouse in a standing dead tree. You can do this, all around. This is not appropriate for living trees. I don't want anybody to go out into their backyard and do this just to their tree tomorrow, but this is a really unique opportunity. Cypress lawn, obviously, there are less people walking through a cemetery than through a busy urban area, but some of these techniques can be used in more frequented areas by people. Alrighty. So I'm going to talk about the habitat value of trees now, how trees are good for wildlife. The main focus is going to be birds. They're my personal favorite. I think they're so charismatic and really important parts of our urban ecosystem. But I'll also talk a little bit about fungus and insects as well on the way. So trees generally provide benefits to birds in three categories: birds and other wildlife in terms of food, shelter, and nesting opportunities. Food can be obvious, right? So in the form of fruits, seeds, and nuts. On the right here, we have a red-breasted nuthatch eating pine nuts from a lodgepole pine. And aren't they just so cute? I love these little birds. And speaking of cute, there is a tussock moth here. These, like oaks and sycamores, some common trees throughout California. Bird feeding on leaves is less common, but insects will eat them, mammals, other wildlife like that. We also get into how the tree branches themselves can provide food in terms of sap. Here's a red-breasted sapsucker. I'm sure many of us on this call may have seen evidence of these small, little, almost geometrically aligned drilling holes created by these birds. They're a specialized kind of woodpecker, and they don't actually drill into the wood. They just drill into the cambium layer that the tree, uses for transporting nutrients and water, and they drink up the sap from those holes. It's mostly cosmetic damage. It's not really a reason to be concerned about the tree unless it's extreme damage. But just a really interesting feeding strategy by these birds. And then nectar, obviously things like hummingbirds. When we get into the more complicated versions, kind of the less obvious versions of food provided by trees. The insects themselves may be eaten by birds, so things like our cute little tussock moth might get snatched up while it's eating on a leaf. Um, but also larvae that burrow into the wood. So this thing with the enormous head on the bottom here is an oak borer beetle larva. And things like woodpeckers will excavate into the wood um, to forage for these. And these are mostly common in declining or dying trees, things with decay, features that folks might be concerned about if the tree is near their house or in an urban area in a park. But they're really valuable food sources for multiple levels of our food web. Dead and decaying wood also provides nutrients for fungi. I know it's not technically wildlife, but it's not really a plant either, so I wanted to include it here. But this is another thing that people traditionally see as negative parts of a tree. Decaying wood, you see a fungus on it, and maybe that's a cause for concern. Uh, but these things thought of as defects can still be really valuable to this complicated web of urban wildlife that's all wrapped up with trees kind of as the foundation. Another negative, quote unquote, thing that I've heard people talk about with trees, I can't tell you how many times I've been asked what the least messy tree would be to plant, or someone calls me and they want to cut down their mature tree because it has too many leaves and they have to rake it up too much. Um, this leaf litter layer is really important. Oh, excuse me, my slide's a little bit out of order here. Um, Even though it's maybe not the most aesthetic and it can be a little messy, leaf litter offers really important foraging for ground foraging birds like the American robin here or dark-eyed juncos. I do want to go back to that last slide though, because dead and decaying wood has a really, really interesting role in California specifically, and that's the acorn woodpecker. It goes all throughout the whole state, and they have a really, really neat relationship with dead and decaying wood through food storage. They nest and kind of live in colonies, multi-generational colonies of birds. And in dead branches or dead trees or dead tissue such as outer bark, they'll create these little openings and in the fall gather acorns and store them over winter. As they dry and shrink, they'll move them around and rotate them so they're secure. It's a really, really complex operation here, and they store this food for decades in these old trees that are declining or dead or falling apart. They're still incredibly important to this bird species, a really, really interesting, charismatic bird, one of my favorites. All right. So they also provide shelter to birds, kind of temporarily speaking, shelter from predators, from weather, from people, and from noise. So here are some great blue herons in a palm. Um, Palms are excellent for dissipating road noise when they're in the crown. It's a lot more comfortable for them to be in there. And it also doesn't have to come from really tall, big trees. So things like these Pacific wrens hop around in the understory in small trees or shrubs. So this textural diversity that trees offer to the landscape is really, really a unique opportunity for shelter. And finally, nesting. So I'll go over three categories of nests here. The first being nests that are supported by the tree. Pretty obvious, right? I'm sure we've all seen something like this cup nest on the right, the quintessential bird nest. Some birds create hanging or pendulous nests, like this one in the center. Things like your orioles or bush tits, things like that. This illustration actually shows it hanging from the underside of a palm frond. And finally, big platform nests, things like your hawks and eagles. Anecdotally, they tend to prefer the largest trees in my area. Those tend to be, in urban areas, the much vilified blue gum eucalyptus. So even these trees that are maybe a lot of people's least favorite tree, the hawks don't care. They really like them and they prefer them for nesting. So it just goes to show that a lot of the value really comes from the architecture and the structure of these trees. Beyond the branches, birds also nest inside the trees, and this is really where the decay and dead trees come in, right? So these nesting cavities tend to prefer decayed wood, which makes sense. Like if I was tasked with excavating my bedroom using only my face, I would prefer decayed wood. It's softer, it offers less resistance, and it's easier for these woodpeckers to create their homes. They find a really unique middle ground here, oftentimes preferring living trees with decay in the center of the trunk, so they can excavate that decayed center bit while the shell wall is still living. The ways, I won't go into too much detail, but the way that tree biomechanics work, the forces that happen when parts bend or sway in the wind are really only born from the outside of a piece of wood, much like a pipe. So these internal cavities sometimes don't affect the strength of these pieces as much as we would really be worried about. So the cavity nest can either be excavated by something like the woodpecker on the right, or a natural cavity, something that is formed after a branch has broken out or a pruning wound has happened to a tree. So an example would be something like this old valley oak here, where a huge scaffold branch broke out on the left. The tree's still standing, it's still pretty stable. There's nothing around it to hit or another branch to fall out of it. And these are really valuable cavities for nesting and for other wildlife to use. Finally, there are some nests in the understory. These are less tree dependent, but tree adjacent. I'll say the ground litter can be really important for these as well. But these are, scrape nests are more common with things like killdeer, shorebirds, and things like that. So to boil it down, simply put, more tree equals more wildlife benefit. And that is true, on a landscape scale. Obviously, if we have more trees out in the world, the aggregate benefit of those trees is going to be greater. But what I really like focusing on and have been thinking about in recent years is on an individual tree level. And you can think of these two valley oaks as a really good example. So this is the same species of tree. They're both in the Bay Area, both at different job sites of mine. And the one on the left is a young tree, probably planted in the last 10 years or so. It's a really nice tree. It's in good health. It has good, it's well structured. It's a nice looking tree, but it just doesn't compare to this valley oak on the right. This is in Walnut Creek. It's potentially the oldest tree in the city, several hundred years old, and it is enormous. That trunk, you can kind of see some bucket trucks in the back of this picture, but the trunk is about 8 or 10 feet wide. The canopy must be approaching 100 feet wide. It's an enormous tree. And you can just think about, a couple of small birds in this tree on the right, but the tree on the left, excuse me, the tree on the right has much more complicated branch architecture that offer more opportunities for a bird to have its needs met or its preferences met in terms of shelter, in terms of nesting or food sources. So these old trees, potentially with decaying branches or dead whole trees, are really important features of our urban landscape. I'll go over some of the things of these, I'll call them habitat trees now, that are dying or declining that are useful for wildlife. I won't read each one of these individually just because there's a lot on here. Um, but things like on the top right here, these large vertical cavities or smaller cavities, delaminating bark, cavities at the base, all of these things offer structural diversity to the tree that wildlife love to use. Many of these are traditionally seen as defects. They can increase the odds that the tree or the part of the tree that these features are on will break. And, that's just a fact. But there is a system to assess that risk, and you can keep these features in the landscape even in urban areas, which I will get into in a bit. Uh, A cavity is a condition of a tree. It's not a verdict, is kind of what I like to say. What really matters is where the feature is on the tree, how large it is, how much sound wood is around it, and how you expect the tree to have compensated for that loss in strength. And just as importantly, what the site asks of the tree. What do you want the tree to provide, and what can it reasonably safely deliver in that site? Many of these wildlife features become better over time. These wildlife trees are more important as time grows. This is a really beautiful illustration by Brian French. He's an arborist up in the Pacific Northwest, so he chose to illustrate this using what looks like a Douglas fir. So we can see the years that this tree has been alive on the x-axis, horizontal, and arbitrary measure of units of habitat. But you obviously can't measure that, but for the sake of this diagram that is on the vertical axis, you can see this newly planted tree next to this tiny little person on the left offers some benefit, but not a ton. 30 years, there's some more branching, there's some more units of habitat there. But when it really starts getting interesting and getting valuable is once it starts doing weird things. Like in this 200-year tree, the top has died. Some branches are trying to replace that apical control and are starting to sweep upwards. In year 400, the form of the tree looks more like a candelabra than a typical Christmas tree. And this complicated branch architecture is important for a few different reasons. So we can see these listed on the left. The structural complexity is much higher. With these larger branches and larger number of branches, there's more opportunities for cavities to develop. Also, the size of the cavities can be larger on larger trees. Things like your barn owl will use those. There's much more diversity in the height of habitat offered, along with the sources of food. A lot more diversity of plants and animal species that you'll find on the tree in these older, larger trees. With that goes fungi, algae, bryophytes, root systems that are much better at bringing in nutrients from a bigger distance to feed the understory plants, and also dead and decaying substrate that gets trapped in these branch unions. So these older trees are really, really valuable resources, even if they have dead parts or are completely dead. And you can relate this back to our valley oak here. So this tree on the left maybe only makes up this much of the tree on the right. You could fit hundreds of this tree. So not all trees are the same. And kind of an unfortunate reality is that as urbanization increases, these old cool trees, really complex trees, are rare. Either they compete with buildings for space and have to be removed, or somebody decides that the tree is too risky to keep and it gets removed, or it simply just dies because the city is a really, really hard place to grow a tree. So as these complex trees become rare, so do populations of cavity and dead branch dependent wildlife. Things like these acorn woodpeckers. It would be extremely unlikely to see one of these in the city limits of San Francisco, simply because there's no tree that offers these specific qualities that they require. However, that gives us a cool opportunity. We can support these species of wildlife by preserving old trees with these features. And here are, kind of two examples of how working with trees and plants in general is indirectly working with wildlife. These are two trees that I looked at, pictures from two trees that I was tasked with looking at in the Presidio of San Francisco. It's a national park within city limits, a really cool place if you ever get the chance to visit. On the left, I was trying to evaluate some decaying bark to see if that was making it into the wood and making the tree less stable. And in that pursuit, I exposed this arboreal salamander. It was so cool. Like, what a surprise, seeing a salamander like this in a major city like San Francisco. Similarly, this tree on the right, also in the Presidio, this big dead stem on the right was on this old Monterey cypress. There's a hiking trail kind of underneath there, and I was trying to decide how risky this dead piece was. And as I was looking at the tree, a red-shouldered hawk landed on it. So these pieces are frequently used by wildlife, and it was just such a treat to be able to see that in action. Okay, so now that I have gone over some of the basics of how trees are good for wildlife, I mean, we already know that they're good for people, so I feel like I didn't have to talk about that today. I'm going to get into maybe some of the more complicated parts of this. Obviously, um, some tough decisions have to be made in figuring out which of these trees or dead tree parts are appropriate to preserve in urban areas. So how do we make those decisions? Well, it all comes down to risk-benefit balance. Simply put, when people or property are present, trees, even living trees, even completely defect-free, perfect-looking trees can pose risks. So risks to people in injury, property damage, or disruption of activities like electrical service or traffic, things like that. Um, some elements that are favorable to wildlife, those dead branches, those big, old, cool trees, may also increase tree risk depending on what is around them. If they're more likely to break apart, maybe they're more likely to hit something of value. But there are many documents in the arborist world that outline how to do this effectively in a systematic way where you can make informed decisions. One of which being the tree risk assessment qualification. It's a credential in arboriculture designed for this purpose specifically. And it was just revised this past year and included some extra information on how this can be incorporated with wildlife benefit management too. So I'm really excited about that. To give a brief little crash course on how tree risk works, you have to have three considerations. One being potentially the most obvious, how likely something is to fall, how likely is a tree or a tree part to fail within a defined period of time. So, all trees are going to fall over eventually, like people, they have a limited lifespan. What is important is picking a time frame that's reasonable enough to make a decision about the tree in and evaluating it with that in mind. The second consideration is likelihood of impacting a target. So were that tree to fall over or branch to fall out of the tree, how likely would it be to hit something of value? And finally, if it does hit that thing, how serious is it going to be? Is it going to dent a car or is it going to cut through, a house or something like that? If you remove any of these three considerations, you do not have a risky tree, even if it's dead. So take this tree, for example. This is a stone dead Monterey pine. You cannot get more dead than this tree. My friend Steve Duffy at the Presidio, again, is the forester there, and they really like creating these snags. And snag, I'm not sure if I've defined that yet. That just means a standing dead tree or a dead branch attached to a living tree. They really like creating these snags. Traditionally, many, if not most, arborists would recommend that you move this tree because it's dead. But if this tree were removed, you would lose all of the potential wildlife value of it, and I think really lose a valuable resource for no good reason. This tree was farther from any target than its height, so if it were to fall over, there's no way it would hit anything of value. There are no trails near the tree, so this was really a no-brainer to preserve it and just let it run its course, decay, and fall apart in place over time. That being said, it does risk kind of follows a trend as trees grow and age and mature and fall apart. These smaller trees on the left, obviously, are not that risky. If they fall over, it's not going to cause much damage. As they grow into maturity, this is mostly the risk increases mostly just because the tree is bigger and the consequences are more severe if it were to fall on something. Once we get to this fourth from the left stage, where this tree really becomes interesting from a wildlife perspective, there's some cavities, there's some dead branches, some asymmetry. Risk continues to climb through the tree's death, and then from an arborist perspective, tree risk ends once the tree is on the ground. You don't need an arborist to identify a tripping hazard for you. So traditionally, this is how we, I mean, the royal we, I think in general in American arboriculture, or just tree valuation in general, this blue curve in theory is kind of how we value trees, where these young trees are less valuable, but they grow in value as they mature and are still in good health. And then once they start declining, once they start developing these wildlife features, the value, at least to people, uh, is seen as less. And where it intersects with risk, so where the blue dotted line and the red dotted line overlap, I've drawn the vertical, kind of darker blue dotted line. I think that's where we really start losing a whole bunch of valuable trees in the landscape that have plenty of life left and even more wildlife value left. So this is where the hard decisions need to be are made. And I think some creative approaches are left on the table traditionally. If you were to ask a bird to define the value of a tree, they might do something more like this, where still these smaller trees are less valuable, but the value keeps growing even until a dead tree is just dead and standing. And more importantly, it doesn't end when the tree falls over. These dead branches, dead trunks decaying on the ground still offer a whole lot for wildlife. So maybe if they were tasked with making decisions about tree risk, they might put the axis way out here. So my goal, um, with this talk and just in general, is to kind of move where people make these risk decisions a little bit out farther, where we can preserve more of that benefit for longer. And one document that I think does a great job of outlining that framework, which can be, obviously used by arborists, but used as a gardener or any sort of land steward, is this urban tree risk management document from the Forest Service. So if you have a tree that you're concerned about, let's already assume that it's going to fall over, and take that part of the equation. The first step here is it possible to move the target, to move what you're concerned about the tree hitting? If you can, yes, move the target and you're done. You don't have to think any more about that tree, and it can just stay out there and continue benefiting the landscape. Number two, can you perform any mitigative actions that will reduce risk to the public with minimum impact to wildlife? So here is where some creative techniques can come in. You can partially remove the tree in drastic scenarios. You can simply prune a branch or, reduce the size of it. If yes, do that, and then you're done. This one has closing the site as number 3. I don't really think that makes sense there. I think that makes more sense to have kind of tied to moving the target, but I didn't write this. So obviously, if you can close the site, if you can limit access of people to this tree that is potentially going to fall over, it eliminates the target and eliminates the risk, and you don't have to worry about it. What I think is really cool is that removal is almost way down here at the bottom. So you have many steps along the way that you can consider before removing a tree and losing a lot of that value. And there's also a fifth step here, step 5. Can you fell the tree and leave it on site? And you won't obviously in urban areas have a whole lot of space to dedicate to an entire down tree, but you can leave a few branches. Felled trees and wood in general is important to insects, mice, salamanders. I've never seen a bear in a site that I visited. Maybe people here have, but that being said, even though this graphic is more in a rural parkland, this decision-making flow still makes sense in urban areas. So here are some possible techniques that I've had success with and that I've seen others have success with in preserving these wildlife trees. So preserving snags, either a whole dead tree or a dead branch. Some people have preserved bunches of them or single stems. Fracture pruning. So this takes some delicate chainsaw work, but the intent is to mimic the texture of a broken branch. So that kind of jagged texture is a good way for microorganisms to enter the branch and to get that digestion started to provide nutrients up the food chain from the microorganisms to the insects to the birds to the predators. So just a cut, a flat cut on a branch takes longer to decay and doesn't provide benefits as quick. This is not something that you should do on every branch that you prune, but it is an option to keep decay out farther from the main trunk rather than making a huge cut right on the trunk, which is an example of what happened here, but on a tree that I'll talk about a little more in a few slides. If you're really good with a chainsaw, you can create an artificial cavity. So I mentioned this a little bit up top, but here is a diagram and an example of how that can work. It takes some delicate use, some like plunge cutting into the trunk of a tree, but you can create a cavity uh, and preserve the face to make a really, I think, nice looking feature for woodpecker use or for other cavity dwelling birds. Again, this is pretty extreme. This is not something that I would recommend doing on a healthy, living tree. But if it's a tree you're already considering removing because it's dying or because it's already dead, and you can assess the risk of it or have a professional do that and look at it over time, this is a reasonable way to install a wildlife feature. So again, here is Carson making that in a huge declining Monterey cypress. But you can also make small ones. Here's one that I saw online. I'm pretty sure they just took a small, 6-inch diameter log and kind of stood it up and made one of these little features that is the perfect size for this little chickadee. So just really, really creative stuff that I think is underutilized in making features for these wildlife to use. And again, all of these things need to be paired with tree risk assessment by a qualified professional and a plan for eventual removal or failure. And what I mean by that is you can't create, or you shouldn't, I strongly recommend not creating one of these features and then just forgetting about it. Because one, dead trees don't get better. It's only going to decay more and lose more structural stability until it falls over. That happens over a long period of time, and there are many tools to assess that and decide when to remove the tree. But really, these features are a commitment to monitoring over time. And you can either plan to remove it proactively, or you can make the snag a size to where it won't hit anything if it falls. And after it falls or after you remove it, it's a good idea to consider leaving some wood on the ground. This, in California specifically, you need to be cognizant of fire as well. So this is not, something you want to pile up on the side of your house, but it is another option to consider. Another option that I think is really good to pair with these features is signage. So the Western chapter of the International Society of Arboriculture created this sign on the left. The sign on the right comes from Cypress Lawn Arboretum. Different approaches to this, but I think it is a really useful educational tool. Not everybody is so plugged in to this sphere where they'll see a dead tree and be like, oh, great. I bet that provides a lot of value for wildlife. People are scared of dead trees, and this is a good way to demonstrate that there's an intention behind keeping it in the landscape. So communicating that intention, I have found, is really successful. And to prevent pressure to remove it. If it's known that this feature is there on purpose, people will be less likely to call and ask you to remove it. All right, so at the risk of undermining everything I've said up until this point, not every tree and not every dead branch should be a habitat snag. There are many things to consider. One being the high or low value habitat presented by the snag. If there's a big, telephone pole with no texture, just a cylinder of wood, nothing is really going to use it. Similarly, if a piece of wood is really small, there's less value. There's not no value, but there's less, and maybe it's less important to keep it in the landscape. Here's an example of that. This is technically a snag, but it's only about 4 feet tall. I ran into this while looking at some bigger trees nearby, and I thought it was really neat to see such an interesting little cute snag. You should all consider also, let me try that again. It is also beneficial to look at the habitat offered by the site near to whatever you're considering turning into a snag. What you don't see in this picture on the right is what is behind me when I took this. There's a big stand of mature Monterey pines here. They're probably about 130 years old. Really, really valuable wildlife. In those trees were some crossbill birds. They have really specialized beaks that cross over that are specifically designed to eat seeds out of pine cones. They're only present in extremely high value landscapes. And because this little tiny snag was in that high value landscape from a bird or wildlife perspective, you can see that it's being used. There is woodpecker activity on this little snag, maybe the world's smallest wildlife snag, but it's still being used. This might not be a good feature, say, if a tree along a street died in one of those little tree wells. It probably wouldn't be used by wildlife, but because of what was around this tree, it's still valuable. So it's a complicated balance here. There's also no definitive research for how many snags per unit area is beneficial in urban areas. There is some research into how many snags is kind of the right number in timber plantations. Um, but nobody's really looked into how many is a good number to have in urban areas. Theoretically, there should be a point where, the snag density is high enough that additional dead trees, additional dead branches aren't going to benefit anything because the carrying capacity of the landscape is already met by wildlife, but we don't really know where that is. And if that wasn't hard enough, you also have to bring aesthetics into it. If all of this wasn't subjective enough, you got to bring design into this. Aesthetic balance versus risk versus the wildlife benefit. So my recommendation is to hire a qualified professional if you're looking at trees specifically. A lot of these concepts can be brought down to a shrub level or just general landscape, but with trees, if you're considering keeping a dead tree, hire a qualified professional. And there are a few easy ways to find one. One being looking for an ISA certified arborist with a tree risk assessment qualification. You can go to treesaregood.org and filter through arborists that way. It's kind of fun. You can also go to our Tree Care for Birds website here and look for folks who have taken our training and who want to be contacted to do that kind of work. Outside of trees, you can consider a messy gardening approach. So here's a picture of my front garden. I've kept a dead ceanothus that I cut down. It was right next to the sidewalk, and I just didn't really like how it looked there. It wasn't particularly risky, but I cut it down and I kept it in the landscape among my new native plantings, and I see birds on that thing all the time. It can be as simple as leaving the lawn unmowed, leaving leaves on the ground, leaving downed wood where appropriate. The idea is to create and preserve structural diversity. And the cool thing is that all of these require less work than having a really manicured lawn. So I think that's an advantage. And you can focus on, the plants that you want to put in there rather than making it all neat and tidy. Another way to approach this is to notice what birds are in your area, figure out what they want, and cater to their preferences. So to that end, ebird.org, you can see lists of birds that people have seen in your area. And then you can take that information over to allaboutbirds.org. It's a great resource on learning nesting preferences or just shelter preferences, food preferences of those birds, and you can cater to that. So I'll quickly go through two case studies and then we'll get into Q&A. So these both come from the Presidio at San Francisco. I was tasked with assessing the risk of 8,000 trees throughout the park. Any tree near a trail, near a building, any tree where if something went wrong, somebody could be injured or property could be damaged. And it's a mature population of Monterey cypress and blue gum eucalyptus that were planted when this was still an army base around 130 years ago. So they are really, really old trees. So I'll bring back this pine that we discussed earlier. My eventual recommendation with this was to retain and monitor the tree. And I'm going to kind of explain that system of how I got there. So the standing Monterey pine, I thought they did a really neat job of preserving the scaffold branches. They reduced them to reduce the lever arm and kind of reduce the chances that they're just going to break off. But they kept them on the tree, so there's more opportunities for a bird to use them. Again, here the distance to the nearest target is greater than the height of the tree. There's really valuable habitat nearby, and my risk rating was low. So I recommended that they preserve the tree and monitor over time. And the cool thing was that when I was looking at this tree, a little scrub jay landed on top. And it's always just so gratifying to see wildlife using these features in real time. The second example is kind of the opposite. So this is in an environment where there are people present almost all the time throughout the day. This is at the main transit center in the Presidio. It's one of the most frequently visited tourist stops in the city. All right. So it's a living Monterey cypress in a high use area, but it has this dead stem. So if you can see this stem on the right here is dead, and this is where they carved that artificial cavity and created that coronet cut on top. Here, the distance to the target is smaller than the size of the part. So if the stem were to break, it could hit these benches here in the foreground. However, it was sound wood. I didn't notice any decay in this stem. Once you remove all the foliage, a lot of the weight is taken off and a lot of the drag is removed. So in high winds, this thing isn't whipping around, and I saw no indication that it would break in the next few years. So my risk assessment, even though it was near potential targets, was still low. And my recommendation was to retain and monitor this tree in the same way. So you can maintain these trees safely in urban environments, but it just takes a qualified professional and some intention behind it. What was really cool here was that, even though it's low value habitat, I wouldn't expect this to be used super often just because it's so noisy and there's so many people around. The snag is kind of moderate value. It's not decayed, it's still fresh wood. But it provides a really neat educational opportunity because of how visible this site is. So the high visibility allows the public to, become more comfortable with this management technique. And this is where, personally, I hope this kind of becomes more normalized. And I start seeing these things more and more frequently uh, throughout our landscapes in California. It's much more common up in the Pacific Northwest right now, slowly trickling down here from there, and hopefully keeps going. All right, so in conclusion, tree features traditionally thought of as defects are broadly beneficial to wildlife, commonly beneficial to wildlife. And older trees have many more of these features and are thus more valuable. That being said, as trees age or die, and as size increases, the potential risk may also increase. And a careful balance of risk and benefit has to be met to preserve these trees in our urban landscape. But I think it's worth putting some effort into, and there are many creative solutions that exist towards this end. All right, that's all I've got for today. I just want to say a big thank you to you all here. This was a ton of fun to prepare for, and hopefully you enjoyed it. And I want to thank Tree Care for Birds for Wildlife, Birds and Other Wildlife, Ryan Gilpin and Jillian there, and my whole HBC team. And now I think it's question time.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you so much. That was very interesting. Beautiful pictures too, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Those are all mine. Well, not the birds. Many are mine.
Um, And I also wanted to thank you for putting up the Arborist websites. We
Oh,
get a
yes.
lot of requests for arborists through the Southern California Horticulture Society, and I usually point them to the ISA site. The
Hmm.
trees are good. Also, the consulting arborists,
Yep,
American Society of Consulting Arborists, uh,
sure.
which I think is more for like maybe legal issues. You could
Legal issues,
that a little bit,
consulting.
what the
They're
difference
not
between
going
consulting
to,
and
yeah, the consulting arborist won't come out and do the tree work. If you're looking for like an unbiased opinion, that's where you would go.
okay,
Yeah.
great. So let's get into a few questions here in the chat section. And anybody out there who wants to add a question or please put it in the chat and we will get to that. And just a reminder, we will be giving away a copy of the Birder's Handbook in a few minutes. So first question is, what about a very old, large, dead oak tree in an urban setting? Safe to keep the tree? Question mark.
Yeah. The unsatisfying immediate answer is I don't know. I don't know what's around the tree. I don't know how frequently people are there. It's possible that you can. So, what I have seen people do successfully with old big trees like that. So, let's theoretically say we're talking about a big dead oak in a park. You can think of managing this snag as a tree removal that's stretched over the time frame of years. So you can take out the pieces that are most likely to break and keep the rest of the tree around as it deteriorates, and repeatedly look at it. Every year is good, every 18 months is good, so you can see during different seasons. But really, the name of the game is continued monitoring and planning for that tree to either fall over or coming up with a criteria where you decide, this is not something I can keep anymore. But there's a lot of room between this tree has died and removal that I think is in general moved over a little too quickly.
And hence your whole talk tonight.
Indeed, yeah, the whole reason I'm
Oh, yeah.
here.
Yep. So hire an arborist. And
Hire an arborist, exactly. Yeah.
how about, oh, this is a good question. Is it safe to use fresh mulch and large pieces of wood from a diseased tree?
It depends on the disease. So here, when sudden oak death was kind of coming into prominence here, there were restrictions on moving it between cities and county lines. I wouldn't recommend using that for mulch. Here, there's a new pest that is new here, but common in Southern California, the invasive shot hole borer. Mulch from trees infested with that would be a terrible idea. But fresh mulch, if not diseased, is really, really beneficial, and bioactive and kind of gets all of the microorganisms in the soil going in a really, really powerful way. So be careful of the source, and disease, but I would recommend trying not to find diseased mulch if you can.
Great.
Yeah.
This was an early one regarding copy of training document. I think that was earlier in your talk, probably for the bird people. Would that
Oh,
be
yes.
available on their website?
Yes. So on the Tree Care for Birds website, you can get a free copy of the best management practice document,
Great.
which is great. There's also, blog articles on there, links to videos. There's a lot of educational material on there.
Great. Question about keeping logs in urban spaces. Is that becoming more accepted?
I'm not sure.
Parks?
I'm not sure. I've seen some parks do that up here. Um, Yeah, I'm not totally sure. I
I
have my tiny little
actually
log,
know
but
somebody who has a nice garden up in the Pacific Northwest.
okay.
Moved a huge log that was at a tree yard, and she moved it into her garden, and she planted the whole thing with ferns. It's a fernery now. It's absolutely gorgeous. And it's kind of like the center point of her whole garden. And it's as it breaks down, it's providing all kinds. She's getting mushrooms now.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so
That
that
sounds beautiful. A nursery
yeah,
log.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, logs are great habitat.
Hmm.
You talked a little bit about fire risk. That's obviously on everybody's mind down here in Southern
Absolutely.
California. How
Yeah.
does that enter into your decision making when assessing?
Yeah. So, I'll preface this by saying I'm not a wildland firefighter. This is not really my realm of expertise, but I would approach that by looking at landscape level fuel management. So obviously you wouldn't want to pile a whole bunch of dry, decayed wood right next to your house, or have really tall shrubs underneath something that is potentially more flammable than a living tree. It's really about placement and fuel ladders and spreading fuel over the landscape. So breaks in that are really good for resiliency.
Um, Somebody had any comments about carpenter bees using snags or insects?
Hmm. Yeah, oh sure. Insects, absolutely. As the decay progresses, I mean, some insects will eat the wood, but in cavities, honeybees or carpenter bees can use those. So yeah, it's not just birds that use these features, insects as well.
Great. Um, and somebody asked about if cities allow such a strategy to go slow and cut back in increments. Do you feel like your recommendations are generally accepted now, or are people still resistant? And if it's a dead tree, they just want it out. How
Yeah,
does that go with cities?
that is a really interesting question. So thank you for whoever thought of that. It depends. So part of this would come into how the city approaches tree removals as a whole. Um, their threshold for risk likely wouldn't allow them to keep these as street trees or trees along, walkways or things like that. But I have seen parks here at the Presidio, for example, keeping these trees sometimes in those areas, and definitely in areas where people are less frequent. For privately owned trees, I don't often see cities forcing people to remove trees just because nobody really has time to do that. But how I would approach that would be incorporating some of these management strategies and having a qualified arborist write you a report describing the risk of the tree. Oftentimes, cities will define that in their tree removal criteria that trees with an assessed risk of a certain level meet criteria for removal. I would imagine that if you managed that dead tree in a way that reduced the risk below that tolerance threshold, um, maybe you'd be able to convince them to preserve the tree.
Um, I have a question. I'm trying to look up. Do you know anything about tree search? This is
I
over in the question and answer
don't.
period. What do you think about tree M?
I can't tell you. I don't know what tree M is.
Okay, yeah, it's the U.S. Forest Tree Search.
Hmm,
Not really sure what that is. Okay,
I'm not
anyway.
either.
How about you got a lot of positive comments also, by the way.
Oh,
Uh,
thank you.
Regarding the second case study near the transit center, the limb has no decay and it's low
Hmm.
risk. But
Sure.
could the creation of that artificial cavity then create decay and risk in the future?
Absolutely, and that's kind of the intent. So I'll go back to the picture of it. The reason for making all these textured cuts is to encourage decay, starting from the end. So eventually, it will degrade to a point where they have to either reduce it farther or remove that piece entirely. Um, But this is a perfect example of instead of just immediately removing that whole stem, they've stretched that removal over time, um, and allowed that intermediate zone where they can keep part of it to provide value. But yeah, that's an excellent point, and just goes to show that these things are dynamic and they change over time, even if they are dead, which is why it's crucial to keep eyes on it and keep up with it.
Great. Um, Somebody says the first time they noticed Bewick's wrens in their old garden was when they were too tired to move a bunch of tree trimmings to the green waste bin. So
That's great.
even tree trimmings on the ground
Yeah.
is very attractive to birds because they know that's where the bugs are.
Mm-hmm. And it's less work.
Yes. Um, how about someone wrote, I've heard that Phytophthora is not very active in dry conditions. So wouldn't it be okay to use mulch from a dead oak killed by sudden oak death if the tree is cut down during the summer? I don't know much.
No.
No.
No, it wouldn't be. It's less active in dry conditions. It doesn't mean that it's dead and can't transfer. But that is a good point. Phytophthora needs water,
Mm-hmm.
which is why summer rain can be so detrimental to a lot of our native oaks. It really gets that Phytophthora going. But yeah, I would never recommend that you use mulch from a sudden oak death killed oak anywhere.
Yeah, luckily we don't have that so much down here because it is usually dry during the summer.
Totally, totally.
It's not that it can't happen. So yeah, and then
Mhm.
definitely all the other bugs that are coming in, like the gold spotted oak borer, is now a concern. Um,
Hmm.
the polyphagous shothole borer, we've already gone through that. Um,
Right.
do you also monitor for pests like that? Is that part of your job?
Yes, you read my mind. I was just going to pivot into that. Yeah, so I gave a similar talk here to arborists right after that shothole borer, polyphagous shothole borer was discovered here, and people were concerned about that. Whether these snags would function as amplifier trees and kind of spread the problem throughout. Um, I wouldn't say that's a reason to not consider doing snags outright because you can see evidence of these pests on the tree. So if you continually manage and monitor, you can control for that, but it definitely is something to be mindful of.
Okay.
Yeah.
Somebody mentioned the curator of the rhododendron species botanical garden recommends planting snags.
Mm,
They have a property in Seattle, a renowned stumpery, showcasing
cool.
epiphytic style planting where smaller rhododendrons and ferns grow on or within the old tree stumps. Something along the same lines, and utilizing decaying wood to create the perfect moisture retentive yet well drained acidic environment. So,
That sounds so cool. I gotta go.
yeah, it sounds like that's in Seattle.
Okay.
Oh, he also says, check it out. Your LA Arboretum membership or Descanso membership will get you in for free via their reciprocal program. So,
That's a great tip.
yep. Um, let's see. Oh, Tree M was the okay. We've got an arborist in the audience here who's done a lot of research and
Oh,
been to
great.
a lot of talks. So that's a little bit farther out in the weeds. Um, do you think that tree care for wildlife's training is worthwhile? There's one coming up at the LA Arboretum in March. Would you recommend it?
There is. I do recommend it. I think it's really an interesting way to kind of expand your tool set as an arborist. It's worth it for arborists. If you're not an arborist, you might not get as much out of the day. Um, but I think it's a really, really great training. I help with those all the time. Before the LA Arboretum one, they're doing one at the UC Berkeley Botanical Garden up here. Um, yeah, it's just a great way to meet arborists who think similarly and value similar things too. I can't recommend it enough.
Right. And your company, Bartlett Tree, is nationwide, is it not?
Bartlett Tree Experts is nationwide. I work for They own our company, HortScience, Bartlett Consulting. So my little office is 6 consulting arborists here in the Bay.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, Bartlett Tree Experts is nationwide and into the UK, I think. They have an office there.
Okay. Well, we've slowed down. We've got a lot of very positive comments. And does anybody else have any questions for Mr. Suttle? Don't think so. Just a lot of thank yous and wonderful comments. Somebody had a large pine that fell down in their yard. The insurance company cut only the part they were required off the house. At the rest remains, and I landscaped around it. The trunk at the base is 4 feet wide. It's a big tree. It has a nice curve in the trunk, which I have my dry riverbed flowing under it as a really interesting hole under it where the roots pulled out. More creatures. So I think you've got a lot of converts here already in the audience.
All right. I'm happy to hear that. This was a ton of fun. Thank you for having me.
And I can't share my screen, but just as one other example here in Ventura, the city of Ventura, after the Thomas fire went through and after a drought killed some big redwoods in one of the parks nearby, the local arborist company, one of the younger guys there, took a chainsaw to a couple of the trees and carved eagles on top. And the other one has a whole like 3 owls. So
Sweet.
they made them into basically living, well, not living, but sculptures for
Yeah,
everybody. And that
that's
was
awesome.
supported by the city. So that was pretty cool too.
More
All
creative
right,
reuse.
yeah. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. And our next meeting will be on Friday, March 13th, and that will be in person for Molly and John Chester of Biggest Little Farm documentary fame, and that's going to be at the Los Angeles Zoo. That'll be a live talk. Thank you again, Ryan, and a really interesting talk. So you can spread the word. Don't cut down dead trees.
At least have somebody look at them first.
All right. Thank you very much. Have
All
a good
right.
evening,
Take
everybody.
care.